Marcus Whitfield's hands trembled as he held his 8-month-old twins above the rushing Yellowstone River, his expensive Italian shoes balanced precariously on the weathered bridge railing. The tech billionaire's face was streaked with tears, his billion-dollar empire crumbling behind him like everything else he'd ever loved. "Daddy, sorry," he whispered to Emma and Ethan, their innocent blue eyes staring up at him without understanding. "But you deserve better than a father who destroys everything he touches." The splash echoed through the canyon like a gunshot. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison dropped her binoculars, the metal clattering against the rocks as she watched the unthinkable unfold from her research blind. 30 years of studying wolves had never prepared her for this moment of human madness. But as the baby's cries faded beneath the dark water, something extraordinary burst from the tree line. A massive black she-wolf moving with desperate purpose toward the river's edge. The same wolf she'd been tracking for 2 years, the one with the impossible maternal instincts. Shadow was about to rewrite everything the world thought it knew about the boundaries between species and love. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison had spent the better part of her 64 years believing that some wounds never heal, they just learn to live quietly in the shadows of your heart. 10 years had passed since her daughter Rebecca died in that senseless car accident on Highway 89, yet Beth still caught herself setting 2 coffee cups on the kitchen counter each morning before remembering she was alone. Well, not entirely alone. Her husband Henry sat in his favorite recliner by the window, his once brilliant mind now lost in the fog of Alzheimer's. Some days he recognized her. Most days she was simply the kind woman who brought him meals and helped him remember how to tie his shoes. The medical bills had already consumed their retirement savings, forcing Beth to mortgage the small cabin they'd built together 40 years ago in the shadow of the Tetons. Beth adjusted her worn binoculars and scanned the riverbank below, searching for any sign of the Yellowstone wolf pack she'd been documenting for the National Park Service. 3 decades of field research had taught her that wolves were predictable creatures, family-oriented, territorial, and governed by ancient instincts that humans had spent centuries trying to understand. But Shadow was different. The massive black she-wolf had been wandering alone for 2 years now, ever since hunters killed her entire pack just outside the park boundaries during a controversial culling operation. What made Shadow truly extraordinary wasn't her size or her intelligence. It was her unprecedented maternal behavior toward other species. Beth had documented her attempting to care for orphaned elk calves, injured ravens, even a lost bear cub that had wandered too far from its mother. "It's like she's trying to mother the whole damn forest," Beth had told her colleague, Dr. Sarah Kim, during their last research meeting. "I've never seen anything like it in 30 years of wolf study." Through her telephoto lens, Beth could see the old wooden bridge where tourists often stopped to photograph the dramatic river gorge below. Today, a lone figure stood on the railing, a man in an expensive suit holding what appeared to be 2 small bundles. Beth's blood ran cold as recognition hit her. She'd seen this man's face on the news. Marcus Whitfield, the tech billionaire whose world had publicly unraveled over the past 3 years. First his son Michael's death from medical malpractice, then his wife Sarah's suicide, and now the very public dissolution of his company amid financial scandals. The bundles in his arms weren't packages. They were babies. Beth fumbled for her radio with shaking fingers, but before she could call for help, movement in the forest caught her eye. Shadow emerged from the dense pine thicket, her amber eyes fixed intently on the bridge above. The wolf's body language was unlike anything Beth had ever observed, tense, alert, but not predatory. She was watching, waiting, as if she somehow knew what was about to happen. As if she'd been preparing for this moment all along. The sound that escaped Marcus Whitfield's throat wasn't quite human, a keening wail that seemed to rise from the deepest cavern of grief. Beth watched through her binoculars as he swayed on the bridge railing, clutching his twins against his chest like a man drowning in his own despair. "I failed, Michael," he sobbed to the wind. "I failed Sarah. I won't fail you by letting you grow up with a monster." The words carried across the canyon with crystalline clarity, each syllable a dagger that pierced Beth's heart. She'd heard similar confessions before, whispered in hospital corridors and therapists' offices, the broken language of parents who'd lost everything and couldn't find their way back to the light. Marcus stepped forward. The babies fell. Time seemed to fracture into impossible fragments. Beth heard her own scream echo off the canyon walls as two tiny forms disappeared into the churning white water below. Her radio crackled to life in her trembling hands, but the words wouldn't come. How do you report the impossible? How do you explain watching a man throw away the most precious things in the world? Then Shadow moved. The black wolf exploded from the tree line like a force of nature unleashed, her powerful legs carrying her down the steep embankment in gravity-defying bounds. Beth had studied wolf locomotion for decades, but she'd never witnessed anything like this. Shadow was moving with a desperation that transcended normal animal behavior, as if driven by something far beyond instinct. The wolf hit the water at full speed, her sleek form cutting through the current with the precision of a missile. Emma and Ethan had already been swept 50 yards downstream, their cries barely audible above the river's roar. Beth found herself holding her breath, her scientific mind calculating the impossibility of what she was witnessing, while her heart screamed silent prayers to whatever force might be listening. Shadow reached Emma first, her powerful jaws clamping gently around the baby's clothing as she fought against the current. The wolf's swimming technique was unlike anything in the textbooks. She was using her body as a shield, protecting the infant from the rocks and debris while maintaining just enough momentum to stay afloat. But Ethan was being pulled toward the rapids. Without hesitation, Shadow released Emma onto a fallen log that had wedged against the riverbank, then dove back into the torrent. Beth watched in amazement as the wolf somehow managed to reach the second baby just as he disappeared over a small waterfall. For a terrifying moment, both wolf and child vanished beneath the churning foam. When Shadow's head broke the surface again, Ethan was clutched securely in her mouth, unconscious but breathing. The wolf's amber eyes met Beth's across the distance, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding that transcended species, a recognition of shared purpose. Beth scrambled down the embankment, her arthritic knees protesting every step. By the time she reached the water's edge, Shadow had managed to pull both babies onto a rocky outcropping 20 yards upstream. The wolf was performing what could only be described as canine CPR, using her snout to press against each baby's chest while her tongue cleared their airways. "Dear God," Beth whispered, pulling out her satellite phone with shaking fingers. "This is Dr. Morrison at Observation Post 7. I need immediate medical evacuation at coordinates." She stopped mid-sentence. Shadow had lifted her massive head and was staring directly at her, those intelligent amber eyes seeming to weigh and measure. The wolf's message was clear. These babies were under her protection now, and any human who approached would be considered a threat. Emma began to cry, a strong, healthy wail that echoed off the canyon walls. Shadow immediately moved to comfort her, using her warm body to shelter both infants from the mountain air. Ethan stirred and joined his sister's chorus, their voices creating a strange harmony with the river's endless song. Beth found herself caught in an impossible dilemma. Every instinct screamed at her to rush forward, to get these babies to a hospital immediately. But her decades of field experience told her that approaching a protective wolf, especially one this size, could trigger an attack that would endanger everyone. Instead, she did something that went against every protocol in the book. She sat down on a boulder 30 feet away and began to speak in the low, calming tones she'd learned from a lifetime of working with wild animals. "It's okay, girl," she murmured. "I'm not going to hurt them. You did good, Shadow. You saved them." The wolf's ears pricked at the sound of her name. Of course she knew it. Beth had been tracking her for 2 years, speaking that name into recording devices and research logs, but this was the first time human and wolf had been close enough for true communication. Shadow settled more comfortably around the babies, her body creating a living fortress of warmth and protection. Emma and Ethan seemed to sense they were safe, their cries gradually subsiding into the peaceful sounds of sleeping infants. As the afternoon sun slanted through the canyon, Beth realized she was witnessing something that would change everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between civilization and wilderness, between human love and animal instinct. The first 24 hours changed everything Beth thought she knew about the natural world. Shadow had carried both babies to a sheltered cave system half a mile upstream, moving with the careful precision of a mother who understood that her children's lives depended on every decision. Beth followed at a respectful distance, documenting everything while maintaining radio contact with the search and rescue teams that were now combing the area. "Dr. Morrison, this is Ranger Captain Stevens. We need those coordinates immediately. Every minute counts with hypothermic infants." Beth stared at her GPS device, her finger hovering over the transmit button. "Tom, I need you to trust me on this. The babies are safe for now. Shadow, the wolf, she's protecting them. If we go in with a full team, she might relocate them somewhere we can't follow." The radio crackled with static and frustration. "Beth, with all due respect, those children need medical attention. We can't leave them with a wild animal." "She's not just any wild animal," Beth insisted, watching through her telephoto lens as Shadow carefully arranged pine needles and soft moss around the babies like a primitive nest. "Tom, in 30 years of field research, I've never seen behavior like this. She's actually nursing them." The silence on the other end of the radio stretched for nearly a minute. When Stevens finally responded, his voice was tight with disbelief. "That's impossible. Wolves don't—" "I know what wolves don't do," Beth interrupted. "But I'm watching her do it anyway." What she was witnessing defied every principle of wildlife behavior she'd ever studied. Shadow was lactating, producing milk despite having no cubs of her own. The wolf's maternal instincts had somehow triggered a biological response that shouldn't have been possible. Beth had read about similar phenomena in domestic dogs, but never in wild wolves, and certainly never in response to human infants. By the second day, the media had descended on Yellowstone like a plague of locusts. News vans lined the park access roads, and helicopters circled overhead despite strict no-fly orders. The story had exploded across social media. Tech billionaire throws babies into river, wolf saves them. Every news outlet in the country was running the story, most of them getting the details completely wrong. Beth's satellite phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deals, and offers from wildlife documentarians. She ignored them all, her attention focused entirely on the extraordinary drama unfolding in the cave below. On the third day, everything changed again. Beth was adjusting her telephoto lens when she noticed something unusual in Shadow's behavior. The wolf kept pawing at something partially buried beneath the cave's sandy floor, something that glinted metallic in the filtered sunlight. When Shadow finally unearthed the object, Beth's heart nearly stopped. It was a collar, and an old leather collar with a metal nameplate. Through her lens, Beth could just make out the engraving. Shadow, property of Margaret Chen, Cody, Wyoming. The name hit Beth like a physical blow. Margaret Chen had been Rebecca's college roommate at the University of Wyoming, a brilliant genetics student who'd gone on to work for the National Institute of Health. Beth remembered her from graduation day, a quiet, intense young woman who'd hugged Rebecca goodbye with tears in her eyes, promising to stay in touch forever. They had stayed in touch, at least for a while. Beth vaguely recalled Rebecca mentioning Margaret's letters during those precious phone calls home during college. Something about special research, about a wolf she'd rescued and raised from a pup. But that had been over 15 years ago, before Rebecca's life was cut short on that terrible night in October. With shaking hands, Beth pulled out her satellite phone and dialed directory assistance. Cody, Wyoming. I need a number for Margaret Chen. The automated voice that answered seemed to stretch through eternity. I'm sorry, that number's been disconnected. A quick internet search on her phone revealed why. Dr. Margaret Chen had died 3 years ago from ovarian cancer, leaving behind groundbreaking research on animal behavioral genetics and a modest estate that had been tied up in probate court ever since. The pieces began clicking together in Beth's mind like tumblers in a lock. Margaret hadn't just rescued Shadow. She'd raised her, trained her, studied her. The wolf's unprecedented maternal behavior wasn't an anomaly. It was the result of years of careful conditioning and possibly something else, something Margaret had discovered in her research. But why had Shadow been released into the wild? And how had she ended up in Yellowstone, hundreds of miles from Cody? On the 4th day, Shadow made a decision that forced Beth's hand. The babies were growing restless, their cries echoing through the cave system with increasing frequency. Despite Shadow's devoted care, they were beginning to show signs of dehydration. Emma's lips were slightly blue, and Ethan's breathing had become shallow and rapid. Beth watched through her binoculars as Shadow attempted to comfort the crying infants, her massive head nuzzling them gently while soft whimpers escaped her throat. The wolf was experiencing something Beth had never seen in a wild animal: visible, emotional distress. Shadow was suffering because her adopted children were suffering, and she didn't know how to help them. The decision that followed would haunt Beth for the rest of her life. She stood up from her hiding place and began walking slowly toward the cave, her hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Shadow immediately moved to block the entrance, her lips pulling back to reveal formidable canine teeth. But there was something different in the wolf's posture: desperation rather than aggression. I know you remember me, girl, Beth said softly, stopping 20 feet from the cave mouth. I know Margaret trained you to trust humans. These babies need help that you can't give them. Shadow's amber eyes seemed to search Beth's face as if trying to read her intentions. For a long moment the two females stared at each other across the divide between species, each weighing the cost of trust against the price of loss. Finally, Shadow stepped aside. The rescue operation that followed became the most delicate wildlife negotiation in Yellowstone's history. Beth spent 3 hours sitting at the cave entrance, speaking in low, soothing tones, while Shadow paced anxiously between her and the babies. Every few minutes, the wolf would check on Emma and Ethan, gently licking their faces and adjusting their makeshift nest with the precision of an experienced mother. When the medical team finally arrived, led by Dr. Sarah Kim, an animal behaviorist Beth had worked with for years, Shadow's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The wolf's hackles rose like black spears along her spine, and a growl that seemed to emerge from the earth itself rumbled through the canyon. "Everyone stop," Beth commanded, raising her hand as the team froze 50 yards away. "She's not being aggressive, she's being protective. There's a difference." Dr. Kim approached slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Beth, those babies have been without proper nutrition for 4 days. We need to move now." "I know," Beth replied, never taking her eyes off Shadow. "But if we rush this, she could grab them and disappear into the backcountry. We'd never find them again." What followed was a negotiation unlike anything in the annals of animal psychology. Beth began by offering Shadow food, fresh salmon she'd requested from the park's wildlife management team. The wolf accepted the offering but never moved more than a few feet from the babies. Next, Beth tried something unprecedented. She lay down on her side in a submissive posture, the way wolves communicate non-aggression to pack leaders. Shadow's ears pricked forward with interest, but she remained vigilant. "Dr. Morrison," radioed Captain Stevens from the command post, "we're getting pressure from the FBI to move in. They're calling this a hostage situation." "Tell them the hostage taker is trying to save the hostages," Beth snapped back. "Give me more time." The breakthrough came when Dr. Kim remembered something from Margaret Chen's research files, which the FBI had confiscated as part of their investigation into Marcus Whitfield's background. Margaret had trained Shadow using specific verbal commands, treating her more like a service dog than a wild animal. "Try gentle care," Dr. Kim suggested, reading from her tablet. Margaret's notes say Shadow was trained to respond to that phrase during medical examinations. Beth took a deep breath and spoke the words clearly. "Shadow, gentle care." The effect was immediate and miraculous. Shadow's aggressive posture melted away, replaced by an alertness that suggested recognition and trust. She moved aside, allowing Dr. Kim to approach the babies while maintaining her protective watch. What the medical team discovered in that cave challenged everything they thought they knew about interspecies relationships. Emma and Ethan were not only alive, they were thriving. Their weight had actually increased during their 4 days with Shadow, and their vital signs were stronger than many infants who'd never left the hospital. "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the pediatric specialist who'd flown in from Denver. "According to everything we know about infant nutrition, they should be severely dehydrated and malnourished." But the evidence was undeniable. Shadow had somehow managed to provide everything the babies needed: warmth, nutrition, and even the emotional bonding that child development experts considered crucial for healthy brain development. As the medical team prepared to transport Emma and Ethan to the hospital, Shadow began exhibiting behavior that broke the hearts of everyone present. She whimpered continuously, a sound Dr. Kim described as exactly like a human mother crying. When the paramedics lifted the babies into their transport carriers, Shadow attempted to follow, only to be gently restrained by tranquilizer equipment held ready by the wildlife team. "We can't sedate her," Beth insisted, watching Shadow's growing distress. "The psychological trauma could be devastating." Instead, they tried something that had never been attempted in a wild animal rescue. They allowed Shadow to accompany the medical evacuation partway down the mountain. The wolf followed the stretcher team for nearly a mile, staying close enough to keep the babies in sight while maintaining a respectful distance from the humans. At the helicopter landing zone, the final separation became inevitable. Shadow's howl when the medical helicopter lifted off lasted for nearly 10 minutes, a sound so filled with anguish that several of the hardened rescue workers were reduced to tears. The wolf stood on her hind legs, clawing at the air as if trying to follow her adopted children into the sky. "I've heard wolves mourn before," Dr. Kim said quietly, wiping her eyes. "But this is different. This is the sound of a mother losing her babies." Back in Beth's research cabin that night, the phone rang incessantly. News organizations from around the world wanted interviews. Publishers offered six-figure book deals. Hollywood producers pitched movie rights. Beth ignored them all, her attention focused on the stack of research files that Dr. Kim had managed to obtain from Margaret Chen's estate. What she discovered in those files changed everything. Margaret Chen hadn't just rescued Shadow. She'd specifically chosen her for a genetics research project that bordered on the revolutionary. Margaret had been studying empathy markers in mammalian DNA, focusing on wolves because of their complex social structures and their historical relationship with humans. Shadow wasn't just any wolf. She was the product of selective breeding designed to enhance empathic traits, raised from birth to form interspecies bonds that shouldn't have been biologically possible. Margaret's research notes were filled with observations that read more like child development studies than wildlife behavior documentation. Subject shows unprecedented ability to read human emotional cues, one entry noted. Responds to infant distress calls from multiple species. Lactation triggered by exposure to orphaned mammals regardless of species. Remarkable adaptation suggesting enhanced maternal neurochemistry. But the most shocking discovery came in a sealed envelope marked, "In case of emergency." Inside was a letter addressed to "Whoever finds this," dated just 3 months before Margaret's death. If you're reading this, it means Shadow has done something extraordinary. I've spent 15 years studying her, and I know she's capable of things that science hasn't yet learned to explain. She was born with a genetic mutation that affects her oxytocin production, the hormone responsible for maternal bonding and empathy. In simple terms, Shadow experiences love more intensely than any animal I've ever studied. I released her into Yellowstone when I became too sick to care for her, but I've been tracking her through the GPS chip in her collar. She's been watching human families, learning their patterns, waiting for something that I now realize was inevitable. Shadow isn't just a wolf. She's evolution's answer to the question of whether love can transcend species. If she saved someone, please don't let them put her down. She deserves to live freely, to love freely, to be the bridge between our worlds that I always believed she could be. The letter was signed with a shaking hand, the signature of a dying woman who'd spent her life's work creating something beautiful and unprecedented. 3 days later, as Emma and Ethan continued their recovery in the Denver Children's Hospital, their story dominated every news cycle in America. The twins were healthy, alert, and showing no signs of trauma from their ordeal. In fact, pediatric psychologist Dr. Maria Santos noted something remarkable in her initial evaluation. These children display emotional regulation patterns I've never seen in infants their age, she reported. They seem unusually attuned to nonverbal communication, almost as if they've learned to interpret subtle cues that most humans miss entirely. Meanwhile, Shadow had taken up residence near the hospital parking lot, despite repeated attempts by animal control to relocate her. She would appear at dawn and disappear at dusk, always staying just close enough to catch the scent of the babies she'd rescued. The legal questions surrounding Shadow's fate became a national debate. Wyoming's Department of Wildlife insisted she was too habituated to humans for release back into the wild. Animal rights groups argued that she deserved protected status as a heroic animal. The twins' grandparents, Harold and Margaret Whitfield, who'd flown in from Boston to assume custody, made an unprecedented request. They wanted to legally adopt Shadow as part of their extended family. "That wolf saved our grandchildren," Harold told reporters outside the courthouse. "As far as we're concerned, she's earned a place at our table for the rest of her life." But the controversy deepened when the FBI's investigation into Marcus Whitfield revealed something that shocked everyone involved in the case. Hidden camera footage from the bridge showed that Marcus had been visiting the site for 3 consecutive days before throwing the babies into the river, and that Shadow had been watching him each time, following his movements with the intensity of a predator stalking prey. The implications were staggering. Had Shadow somehow known what Marcus was planning? Had she positioned herself to intervene when the moment came? Dr. Kim spent hours analyzing the footage with animal behavior experts from around the world. Their consensus was unanimous and unprecedented. Shadow had exhibited predictive behavior based on human psychological cues, essentially reading Marcus's intentions and preparing to act. "This changes everything we thought we knew about animal intelligence," Dr. Kim announced at a hastily arranged press conference. Shadow didn't just react to the babies being thrown into the river, she anticipated it and positioned herself to respond. That level of cognitive sophistication in a wild animal is completely unprecedented. As the media circus continued to swirl around Yellowstone, Beth found herself at the center of a debate that was reshaping how humanity viewed its relationship with the natural world. The woman who'd spent 30 years studying wolves in quiet anonymity was now fielding calls from the National Geographic Society, the Smithsonian Institution, and wildlife conservation groups from 6 continents. But all Beth could think about was the sound of Shadow's howl echoing through the canyon, the heartbroken cry of a mother forced to watch her children disappear into the sky. The confrontation that would determine Shadow's fate began at dawn on September 15th in the sterile conference room of the Wyoming Department of Wildlife headquarters in Cheyenne. Beth sat across from a panel of officials whose collective decision would either save or destroy the wolf who had captured the world's attention. State Wildlife Director Tom Anderson shuffled through a thick folder of incident reports, veterinary assessments, and legal precedents, his weathered face betraying no emotion. Beside him, Dr. Robert Hayes from the University of Wyoming's Veterinary College tapped his pen nervously against a stack of behavioral analysis reports. "Dr. Morrison," Anderson began, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority, "we appreciate your 30 years of service to wildlife research, but the facts remain unchanged. Shadow has become too habituated to humans for safe release back into the wild. She's taken up residence outside a children's hospital, for God's sake. That's not normal wolf behavior." Beth leaned forward, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Nothing about this situation is normal, Tom. Shadow didn't just save those babies. She outsmarted a team of federal agents, demonstrated cognitive abilities that rewrite the textbook on animal intelligence, and showed more parental instinct than their biological father." "Which is exactly why she's dangerous," interjected Dr. Hayes. "A wolf that thinks it's human is a wolf that's lost its natural fear response. What happens when she approaches another family with children? What happens when those children don't need rescuing?" The question hung in the air like a death sentence. Under Wyoming state law, any wildlife deemed habituated beyond rehabilitation faced immediate euthanization. It was a policy designed to protect both humans and animals from dangerous encounters, but applying it to Shadow felt like condemning Mother Teresa for caring too much. "There's another option," Beth said quietly, pulling a manila folder from her briefcase. Margaret Chen's estate left provisions for exactly this situation. She slid the documents across the table, watching as Anderson's eyebrows rose with each page he read. Margaret's will had been thorough and prescient, establishing a trust fund specifically for Shadow's care in the event that she ever performed what the document termed heroic intervention behavior. $2.3 million, Anderson read aloud, for the establishment and maintenance of a specialized sanctuary facility. He looked up at Beth with something approaching amazement. She actually predicted this would happen? "Margaret knew Shadow better than anyone," Beth replied. "She spent 15 years documenting behaviors that mainstream science refused to acknowledge. She knew that eventually Shadow would do something that forced us to confront our assumptions about animal consciousness and empathy." Dr. Hayes remained skeptical. "Even with funding, we're talking about setting a dangerous precedent. Every time someone claims their pet performed a heroic act, we'll have pressure to grant them special status. Show me another animal that saved human lives while demonstrating the cognitive sophistication to anticipate human behavior," Beth challenged. "Show me another wolf that's triggered worldwide legislation protecting heroic animals. Shadow isn't just special, she's unprecedented." The debate that followed lasted 6 hours and drew testimony from experts around the globe via video conference. Dr. Jane Goodall spoke passionately about the need to recognize animal consciousness. Temple Grandin argued for Shadow's right to live freely based on her demonstrated intelligence. Mark Bekoff from the University of Colorado presented evidence that Shadow's empathic abilities represented an evolutionary leap that could reshape our understanding of interspecies relationships. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Harold Whitfield, the twins' grandfather, who had driven through the night from Denver to make his case in person. "I'm 73 years old," Harold said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've buried my daughter. I've watched my son-in-law destroy himself with grief, and I've nearly lost my grandchildren to tragedy that shouldn't happen to any family. But that wolf, that remarkable, impossible wolf, she gave us back hope." He paused, pulling a small photograph from his wallet. "This is Emma and Ethan yesterday at the hospital. Look at their faces. They're not traumatized. They're not afraid. They're peaceful in a way that babies who've never known danger can't be." Shadow didn't just save their lives. She gave them something precious that their own father couldn't, the knowledge that they're worth protecting. Harold placed the photograph on the conference table where everyone could see it. Emma and Ethan were sleeping peacefully in their hospital cribs, their tiny fists curled around stuffed wolves that well-wishers had sent from around the world. "My wife and I want to adopt Shadow legally," Harold continued. "We want her to be part of our family, part of our grandchildren's lives. We'll fund the sanctuary, we'll hire the best animal behaviorists in the world, and we'll make sure she never poses a threat to anyone. But please don't kill her for the crime of loving too much." The silence that followed Harold's plea stretched for nearly 5 minutes. Anderson stared at the photograph, his bureaucratic composure finally cracking. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "In 35 years of wildlife management, I've never faced a decision like this. Every protocol says we should euthanize Shadow for public safety. But every instinct I have as a human being says that would be the greatest injustice this department has ever committed." Dr. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We're talking about setting a precedent that could have far-reaching consequences. What happens when other wolves start exhibiting unusual behavior? Do we grant them all special status? If they save human lives and demonstrate the intelligence to anticipate human behavior, then yes," Beth replied firmly. "We evolve our policies based on new evidence. That's how science works." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone expected. 3 in favor of establishing the sanctuary, 2 opposed. Shadow's life hung by a single vote, cast by Anderson after nearly an hour of deliberation. "Motion carried," he announced. "Shadow will be relocated to a specialized facility where she can live under controlled conditions while being studied by qualified researchers. The facility will be funded by the Chen Trust and supervised by Dr. Morrison." But even as relief flooded through Beth's chest, she knew the real battle was just beginning. Public opinion remained sharply divided. Conservative wildlife groups argued that she was setting a dangerous precedent that would blur the lines between wild animals and domestic pets. Animal rights activists, while supportive of saving Shadow, worried about the ethics of keeping a wild wolf in captivity, even in the most humane conditions. The controversy exploded across social media, with the hashtag #SaveShadow trending worldwide within hours of the decision. Supporters shared videos of Shadow's rescue, photographs of the twins' peaceful recovery, and testimonials from animal behavior experts who argued that Shadow represented an evolutionary breakthrough in interspecies empathy. Opponents countered with statistics about wolf attacks, warnings about the dangers of anthropomorphizing wild animals, and concerns about the precedent of granting special legal status to animals based on emotional rather than scientific criteria. The debate reached a fever pitch when Marcus Whitfield, speaking from his psychiatric facility through his lawyer, made an unexpected statement that changed everything. "I want the world to know that Shadow didn't just save my children. She saved me too. Watching her care for Emma and Ethan with such devotion, such pure love, showed me what I had thrown away. A wolf understood the value of life better than I did. A wild animal demonstrated more humanity than their own father. If anyone deserves to be called their parent, it's her." Marcus's statement, released simultaneously to every major news outlet, sparked a new wave of support for Shadow. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from dangerous wolf to surrogate mother, from wildlife management crisis to miracle of love transcending species. But the most powerful moment came 3 days later, when Shadow was finally allowed a supervised visit with Emma and Ethan at the hospital. The reunion, captured by a single photographer and broadcast around the world, showed Shadow approaching the baby's cribs with the gentle caution of a mother who hadn't seen her children in weeks. When Emma reached through the crib bars and touched Shadow's nose, the wolf's entire body relaxed into an expression of pure contentment. Ethan made soft, cooing sounds that Shadow answered with equally gentle whimpers, creating a conversation that transcended the boundaries between human and animal communication. For 20 minutes, the unlikely family was reunited, surrounded by medical staff who watched in amazement as two species that evolution had separated millions of years ago found their way back to each other through the simple, powerful force of love. The photograph that captured that moment, Emma's tiny hand pressed against Shadow's massive snout, both their eyes closed in peaceful recognition, became the most shared image in social media history, viewed by over 2 billion people in its first week online. It was the image that finally settled the debate about Shadow's fate, proving that some bonds are too sacred to be broken by laws, protocols, or the artificial boundaries that humans draw between themselves and the natural world. The Margaret Chen Memorial Wildlife Sanctuary opened its gates 6 months later, but what should have been Beth's greatest triumph quickly became her darkest nightmare. Shadow was dying. The magnificent black wolf who had captured the world's attention and redefined humanity's understanding of animal empathy was withering away in captivity, despite having access to the finest veterinary care money could buy. She had stopped eating 3 weeks after arriving at the sanctuary, her powerful frame shrinking with each passing day as she lay motionless in the corner of her specially designed habitat. "It's not her body that's failing," Dr. Patricia Wells, the sanctuary's head veterinarian, explained to Beth during their morning consultation. "All her vital signs are normal, her blood work is perfect, but psychologically she's shutting down. This is what we call broken heart syndrome in animals who've lost their primary attachment figures." Beth stared through the observation window at Shadow's prone form, her heart breaking with each shallow breath the wolf took. Despite the sanctuary's luxurious accommodations, 5 acres of natural forest habitat, a flowing stream, and caves designed to replicate her original den, Shadow showed no interest in her surroundings. She was a wild creature who had tasted the profound joy of motherhood, only to have it stripped away by human decisions and legal protocols. "What about the video calls?" Beth asked desperately. "Can't we arrange more virtual visits with the twins?" Dr. Wells shook her head sadly. "We've tried. Shadow recognizes their voices and scents on the video screen, but it only makes her more agitated. She knows they're there but can't reach them. It's torture, not comfort." The irony was devastating. Shadow had been saved from euthanization only to face a slower, more cruel death from despair. The sanctuary that was supposed to be her reward had become her prison, and the legal protection that was meant to honor her heroism had separated her from the only thing that gave her life meaning. Emma and Ethan, now 13 months old and thriving in their grandparents' care in Boston, had been showing their own signs of distress. Their pediatrician, Dr. Maria Santos, reported that both children had developed an unusual sleep disorder, waking every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time Shadow had been observed pacing restlessly in her habitat. The bond between these children and that wolf runs deeper than we understood, Dr. Santos told Harold and Margaret Whitfield during their weekly consultation. They're exhibiting what we might call phantom maternal separation anxiety. Their nervous systems are somehow still connected to Shadow's emotional state. The twins' behavioral changes had been subtle at first. Emma, who had been an early talker, had stopped vocalizing entirely. Ethan, normally an active toddler, had become listless and withdrawn. Both children showed heightened stress responses to loud noises and unfamiliar people, as if they were constantly listening for something, or someone, who never came. Child psychologist Dr. Jennifer Hayes, brought in to evaluate the twins, made an unprecedented recommendation that sent shock waves through the medical community. These children need their wolf mother. I know how that sounds from a clinical perspective, but we're dealing with a bonding situation that has no precedent in psychological literature. Shadow isn't just an animal they happen to encounter, she's neurologically imprinted as their primary caregiver. The scientific implications were staggering. Dr. Hayes's research suggested that the critical bonding period between Shadow and the twins had created neural pathways that couldn't be replicated by human caregivers, no matter how loving or attentive. The wolf and the children had literally rewired each other's brains during those 4 crucial days in the cave. Harold Whitfield made the decision that would either save or destroy them all. "We're moving to Wyoming," he announced to his wife Margaret over breakfast in their Cambridge home. "I've purchased land adjacent to the sanctuary. If the law won't let Shadow come to the children, then we'll bring the children to Shadow." Margaret Whitfield, a former pediatric nurse who had spent 40 years caring for children, understood the medical risks immediately. "Harold, they're babies. They need stability, routine, pediatric specialists. We can't just uproot their entire lives based on a theory about wolf bonding." "Look at them," Harold replied, gesturing toward the living room where Emma and Ethan sat silently with their toys, their usual babbling replaced by an eerie quiet. "They're fading away just like Shadow is. We're losing all 3 of them, one day at a time." The move, completed within 6 weeks, created a media sensation that divided public opinion even further. Critics accused the Whitfields of endangering their grandchildren for the sake of publicity, while supporters praised them for recognizing a bond that transcended conventional understanding of family relationships. Beth found herself caught between hope and terror as she watched the elderly couple establish their new home just half a mile from Shadow's sanctuary. The proximity allowed for daily visits, but the legal restrictions remained ironclad. No physical contact between the wolf and the children was permitted under any circumstances. The breakthrough came on a cold October morning when Beth arrived at the sanctuary to find Shadow standing alert for the first time in weeks. The wolf's head was raised, her ears pricked forward, and her entire body was oriented toward the fence that separated the sanctuary from the Whitfields' property. "She knows," whispered Dr. Wells, who had arrived moments earlier. "Somehow, she knows they're close." The children's response was equally dramatic. Harold reported that both Emma and Ethan had slept through the night for the first time in months, and that Emma had begun babbling again at breakfast. Their pediatrician, Dr. Michael Torres, who had relocated from Boston to continue caring for the twins, documented rapid improvements in their stress hormone levels and sleep patterns. But it wasn't enough. Shadow remained physically separated from the children by 3 layers of fencing, federal regulations, and liability concerns that kept lawyers working around the clock. She could see them during their daily visits, could hear their voices and catch their scents on the wind, but she couldn't touch them, comfort them, or fulfill the maternal drive that was slowly consuming her from within. The crisis reached its breaking point on Halloween night, when a severe thunderstorm struck the sanctuary with unprecedented fury. Lightning split the sky, and winds exceeding 70 miles per hour brought down trees throughout the facility. In the chaos that followed, a massive pine crashed through two sections of Shadow's enclosure, creating a gap large enough for her to escape. She didn't run toward the wilderness. Instead, Shadow ran directly toward the lights of the Whitfield house, where Emma and Ethan were crying in terror from the storm. Harold found the wolf on his front porch at 2:30 a.m., soaked and trembling, but not from the cold. Shadow was whimpering, the same sound Beth had heard in the cave, the sound of a mother desperate to comfort her frightened children. "What am I supposed to do?" Harold asked Beth over the emergency phone call that brought her racing through the storm. "She's not trying to break in. She's not being aggressive. She's just waiting, like she's asking permission." Beth arrived to find Shadow lying peacefully beside the front door, her massive head resting on her paws as she listened to the twins crying from inside. Every few minutes, the wolf would emit a soft whimper, not distressed, but communicative, as if she were trying to tell the babies that their mother was near and they were safe. The liability issues alone could destroy the sanctuary, Dr. Wells warned, but her voice lacked conviction. She, like everyone else who witnessed Shadow's vigil, was seeing something that challenged every assumption about wild animal behavior. Inside the house, Emma and Ethan had gradually stopped crying. They now stood at the living room window, their small hands pressed against the glass as they stared at the wolf who had risked everything to reach them. When Shadow looked up and met their gazes, both children smiled for the first time since arriving in Wyoming. It was Margaret Whitfield who made the decision that would change everything. The former pediatric nurse, who had spent her career following medical protocols and safety regulations, opened her front door and invited a wild wolf into her home. "Some things," she said quietly to Beth, "are more important than rules." The truth that emerged from Margaret Chen's sealed research files 3 days later would shake the foundations of everything Beth thought she knew about Shadow, the twins, and the impossible events that had brought them together. Harold had been searching through the final boxes of Margaret's estate, looking for any documentation that might help their legal case for keeping Shadow in their home, when he discovered a hidden compartment in Margaret's desk. Inside was a collection of sealed envelopes marked with dates spanning 15 years, a meticulous record that Margaret had kept right up until her death. The envelope marked "Emergency Disclosure, Read Only if Shadow Saves Human Lives," contained revelations that left Beth speechless as she read them aloud to the assembled group in the Whitfields' living room. Shadow lay peacefully beside the twins' playpen, finally at rest for the first time in months. "Shadow isn't just any wolf," Beth read, her voice trembling. "She's the product of a selective breeding program I conducted in secret for over a decade. Her grandmother was a wolf-dog hybrid that displayed extraordinary empathic abilities. I spent years tracking down wolves with similar genetic markers, specifically looking for animals that showed unusual maternal instincts toward other species." Margaret paused, looking at Harold and Margaret Whitfield. "But that's not the most shocking part." She continued reading. "More importantly, I've been monitoring the Whitfield family for 3 years through public records and social media. I knew about Michael's death, Sarah's suicide, and Marcus's deteriorating mental state. I released Shadow into Yellowstone specifically because my research suggested that a traumatic event involving the twins was statistically likely." The silence that followed was deafening. Harold slowly sank into his chair, his face pale with shock. She knew this was going to happen? Not exactly, Beth continued, her voice barely above a whisper as she read on. Margaret's research into family trauma patterns suggested that Marcus was exhibiting behaviors consistent with parents who harm their children during psychotic breaks. She positioned Shadow in the area as a preventive measure. But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. Margaret's letter continued. The genetic connection runs deeper than anyone knows. Through my work at the National Institute of Health, I had access to genetic databases that revealed something extraordinary. Sarah Whitfield, the twins' mother, carried the same rare empathy gene mutation that I bred into Shadow's lineage. This gene, which affects oxytocin production and enhances emotional bonding, means that Emma and Ethan have a biological predisposition to form the same intense bonds that Shadow demonstrates. Dr. Wells, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. She's saying that the twins and Shadow are genetically compatible for bonding in ways that normal humans and wolves wouldn't be? More than that, Beth replied, turning to the next page. Margaret was studying the possibility of creating therapeutic animals specifically designed to help humans with trauma-related disorders. Shadow wasn't just a rescue animal. She was a prototype for a new kind of therapy that could revolutionize how we treat psychological damage. The implications were staggering. Margaret Chen hadn't just been an eccentric scientist who loved wolves. She had been conducting groundbreaking research into the biological basis of empathy and healing. Her work suggested that certain genetic combinations could create bonds between species that were literally therapeutic, triggering biological responses that promoted emotional healing and psychological resilience. But the letter's final revelation was the most shocking of all. I've been in contact with Marcus Whitfield's psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Stone, for the past 6 months, Beth read. Marcus's treatment records show a consistent pattern of self-harm ideation focused on his children. Dr. Stone and I developed a monitoring protocol, and when Marcus began visiting the Yellowstone Bridge repeatedly, we knew intervention was necessary. I couldn't stop Marcus from making his terrible choice, but I could ensure that Shadow was positioned to save the children when he did. Harold's hands were shaking as he processed the implications. You're telling me that this whole thing was orchestrated? Not orchestrated, Dr. Wells corrected quietly. Anticipated. Margaret used scientific methods to predict a tragedy and position Shadow to prevent it. She turned statistical analysis into a rescue mission. The discovery of Marcus's involvement became even more complex when FBI investigators revealed the contents of his psychiatric evaluation files. Dr. Stone's notes showed that Marcus had been planning the bridge incident for weeks, but his motivations were far more complicated than anyone had realized. Marcus wasn't trying to murder his children, Dr. Stone explained during a video conference call from the psychiatric facility where Marcus was being treated. He was trying to give them what he believed would be a better death than the life he could provide. In his psychotic state, he had convinced himself that drowning would be merciful compared to growing up with a father who had failed them. Even more disturbing was Marcus's admission that he had seen Shadow watching him during his previous visits to the bridge. Rather than being deterred, he had interpreted her presence as confirmation that nature would provide a more loving caretaker than he could be. I saw her in the trees, Marcus said during his first lucid interview with investigators. This beautiful, intelligent creature who seemed to understand suffering. I thought maybe if I gave the babies to the river, she would know what to do. I thought a wild animal would show them more love than their broken father ever could. The twisted logic of Marcus's reasoning revealed the depth of his psychological collapse, but it also confirmed Margaret's theory about Shadow's unique role. The wolf hadn't just happened to be in the right place at the right time. She had been unconsciously recruited by a man so desperate to save his children that he had entrusted them to a creature he instinctively recognized as a better parent than himself. Dr. Kim, the animal behaviorist who had been studying Shadow's case from the beginning, made another startling discovery when she analyzed the security footage from Marcus's previous bridge visits. Shadow wasn't just watching Marcus, she reported. She was following him. For 3 days, she tracked his movements, learned his patterns, and positioned herself optimally for intervention. This wasn't instinct. This was planning. The revelation that Shadow had been essentially stalking Marcus before he threw the babies challenged every assumption about animal cognitive abilities. Wolves were known to be intelligent, but this level of predictive behavior suggested consciousness and reasoning skills that bordered on the supernatural. But perhaps the most profound discovery came when geneticists at the University of Wyoming analyzed DNA samples from Shadow, the twins, and their extended family. The results confirmed Margaret's research in ways that no one had expected. The empathy gene mutation that Margaret identified isn't just present in Shadow and the twins, Dr. Amanda Foster announced at a hastily arranged press conference. It's present in approximately 1 in every 10,000 humans, and it appears to be increasing in frequency in recent generations. We may be witnessing an evolutionary adaptation that enhances our species' ability to form bonds with other animals. The implications were revolutionary. Margaret's work suggested that humans were evolving toward greater empathy, not just with each other, but with the entire animal kingdom. Shadow and the twins weren't anomalies. They were harbingers of a future where the boundaries between species became increasingly irrelevant in the face of shared emotional experience. But the most personal revelation came when Beth discovered a final letter in Margaret's files, this one addressed specifically to her. "Dear Elizabeth," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means that Shadow has found her purpose and you've found yours. I know about your daughter Rebecca's death, and I know about Henry's condition. I chose Shadow not just because of her genetic potential, but because I knew she would eventually cross paths with someone who understood loss the way you do. Shadow needs a human companion who knows what it's like to love something so much that losing it nearly destroys you. She needs someone who understands that grief doesn't end. It just learns to coexist with love. You and Shadow are both mothers who have lost your children. Perhaps together, you can learn to be mothers again." Beth looked across the room at Shadow, who was gently cleaning Emma's face with her tongue while Ethan slept peacefully against the wolf's warm flank. For the first time since Rebecca's death 10 years ago, Beth felt the familiar stirring of maternal love, not for her own lost child, but for this impossible family that had somehow formed from the wreckage of multiple tragedies. The legal battles that followed Margaret's revelations were swift and decisive. With documentation proving that Shadow had been specifically bred and trained for therapeutic intervention and genetic evidence supporting the unique bond between wolf and children, the courts granted unprecedented custody arrangements. Shadow was legally recognized as the twins' therapeutic caregiver, with the Whitfield serving as her human support system. The arrangement required regular monitoring by veterinary and child psychology professionals, but for the first time since the rescue, all 3 members of this unlikely family were thriving. Margaret Chen's research was posthumously published in Nature, revolutionizing the fields of animal psychology, genetic therapy, and interspecies bonding. The Margaret Chen Institute for Empathic Research was established at the University of Wyoming, with Beth serving as its first director. But perhaps the most important outcome was the simple daily miracle of watching Shadow care for Emma and Ethan as they grew from toddlers into children who understood that love comes in many forms, sometimes with 2 legs, sometimes with 4, but always with a heart big enough to heal the deepest wounds. 5 years later, Beth Morrison stood at the window of the Margaret Chen Institute for Empathic Research, watching Emma and Ethan play in the meadow behind their home with Shadow and her 3 cubs. The scene that unfolded before her eyes would have been impossible to imagine during those dark days when Shadow was dying in captivity, yet now it seemed as natural as sunrise. Emma, now 6 years old, was teaching Shadow's youngest cub, Hope, to fetch a tennis ball. Her patient instructions and gentle encouragement reminded Beth so much of Rebecca at that age that it sometimes took her breath away. "No, Hope, gentle mouth," Emma said, her small hand guiding the wolf pup's massive head. "Like Mama Shadow showed you." Ethan, always the more adventurous of the twins, was attempting to howl along with Thunder and Storm, Shadow's 2 older cubs. His human vocal cords couldn't quite replicate the complex harmonies of wolf communication, but the cubs seemed to understand his intent, adding their voices to create a strange and beautiful chorus that echoed across the Wyoming landscape. Shadow herself lay peacefully in the shade of an ancient pine, her amber eyes never leaving the children, even as she dozed. At 8 years old, she was entering the prime of her life, her black coat still glossy and her movements still graceful despite the arthritis that had begun to settle in her hips. The wolf who had once been dying of heartbreak was now the matriarch of the most famous interspecies family in the world. Harold Whitfield emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade and sandwiches, his steps more careful than they'd been a year ago, but his smile as bright as ever. At 78, he had defied his doctor's expectations by thriving in the high altitude of Wyoming, his purpose renewed by the daily miracle of watching his grandchildren grow up with their wolf family. "How are they today?" Beth asked as Harold joined her at the window. "Ethan asked if he could sleep in the den with the cubs tonight," Harold chuckled. "Margaret convinced him that human children need human beds, but I think he's planning to negotiate again at bedtime." Margaret Whitfield had adapted to their unconventional life with the grace of a woman who had seen enough in her 75 years to know that love comes in unexpected packages. The former Boston socialite now spent her days reading veterinary journals and learning wolf behavior patterns, determined to understand every aspect of the family that had chosen them as much as they had chosen it. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The first year had required constant supervision from veterinary behaviorists, child psychologists, and legal observers who documented every interaction between the wolves and children. There had been moments of concern when Storm had knocked Ethan down during play, when Emma had wandered too far from the house and Shadow had forcibly carried her back by her jacket, but each incident had only reinforced the depth of the protective bond between species. Dr. Sarah Kim, now the Institute's lead researcher, had published groundbreaking studies based on her observations of the Whitfield Shadow family. Her work on interspecies communication had identified over 40 distinct vocalizations that the children and wolves used to communicate, ranging from basic needs like hunger and fatigue to complex emotional states like comfort and affection. "The children aren't just living with wolves," Dr. Kim explained to Beth during their weekly review meeting. "They're developing a bilateral communication system that's unprecedented in human-animal relationships. Emma and Ethan are becoming genuinely bilingual, fluent in both human language and wolf communication." The implications extended far beyond academic curiosity. The Margaret Chen Institute had become a pilgrimage site for families dealing with childhood trauma, autism spectrum disorders, and severe emotional disturbances. The therapeutic protocols developed through studying Shadow's interactions with the twins were being implemented in facilities across North America with remarkable success rates. But perhaps the most profound change had occurred in Beth herself. The woman who had spent 10 years drowning in grief for her lost daughter had found new purpose in documenting and protecting this extraordinary family. Her research on empathic bonding had earned her international recognition, but more importantly, It had given her a reason to wake up each morning with hope instead of sorrow. Henry's death 18 months earlier had been peaceful, occurring during one of his increasingly rare lucid moments when he recognized Beth and whispered, "Take care of our wolf family." His passing had been devastating, but Shadow's presence during Beth's grief had provided a form of comfort she'd never experienced. The wolf seemed to understand loss in ways that humans couldn't articulate, offering silent companionship during the darkest hours. The legal framework surrounding Shadow's status had evolved into something entirely new in American jurisprudence. The Shadow Protocol established precedents for recognizing therapeutic animals as family members rather than property, with rights and protections that extended far beyond traditional service animal legislation. 17 other animals across North America had since been granted similar status, creating a new category of legal recognition for creatures who demonstrated exceptional empathic abilities. Marcus Whitfield's recovery had been slower, but no less remarkable. Released from psychiatric care after 4 years of intensive treatment, he now served as a volunteer at the Institute, working with families who had experienced trauma-related crises. His first meeting with Shadow since the bridge incident had been carefully orchestrated and deeply emotional. "She forgave me before I learned to forgive myself," Marcus told Beth during one of their counseling sessions. "When I saw her with my children, not my children anymore, but our children, I understood what love was supposed to look like. She showed me what I should have been." The reunion between Marcus and the twins had been gradual and supervised, but ultimately successful. Emma and Ethan knew their biological father's story in age-appropriate terms, understanding that Daddy Marcus got very sick in his mind, but that he was better now. They called him Uncle Marcus and included him in their extended pack, though Shadow remained their primary emotional anchor. The financial success of the Institute had been unexpected but welcome. Margaret Chen's trust fund had been supplemented by book deals, documentary rights, and research grants that had transformed the facility into a world-class center for interspecies research. Beth's memoir, Shadow's Children, had spent 18 months on the New York Times bestseller list, with proceeds funding expansion of the therapeutic programs. More importantly, the Institute had become a beacon of hope for families facing seemingly impossible challenges. The waiting list for their residential therapy program stretched 2 years, filled with children whose traditional treatments had failed, but who showed remarkable improvement when introduced to Shadow's pack. Emma had begun writing what she called wolf stories. Simple narratives about her daily adventures that revealed a child developing with emotional intelligence far beyond her years. Her favorite story, which she dictated to Margaret, began, "Once upon a time, there was a mama wolf who saved 2 babies from the scary water. But the babies saved the mama wolf too, because everybody needs somebody to love." Ethan's development had taken a different but equally remarkable path. His affinity for wolf communication had led to an almost supernatural ability to read animal emotions and intentions. Local veterinarians had begun consulting with him informally when dealing with traumatized or aggressive animals, amazed by his ability to calm creatures that professional handlers couldn't approach. The children's unique upbringing had attracted attention from universities around the world. Harvard's Child Development Program wanted to study their cognitive development. Stanford's Animal Communication Lab sought to document their bilingual abilities. Oxford's Evolutionary Psychology Department proposed longitudinal studies that could span decades. But Beth had learned from Margaret Chen's example about the importance of protecting her subjects while advancing science. Access to Emma and Ethan was strictly limited to researchers who could demonstrate direct therapeutic benefit to other children. The twins would grow up knowing they were special, but not as specimens to be studied, as pioneers in a new understanding of what it meant to be human. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the unusual family gathered for their evening ritual. Shadow called her cubs with a low howl, while Harold and Margaret called the children for dinner. But instead of separating into species groups, they all moved together toward the house. 2 elderly humans, 2 young children, and 4 wolves, bound by something stronger than blood or biology. Beth watched from her window as Emma took Shadow's massive paw in her small hand, as Ethan raced ahead with the cubs, as Harold and Margaret followed behind with the patient smiles of grandparents who had learned that miracles come in unexpected forms. In the distance, she could see the memorial garden they'd planted for Henry, Rebecca, and Margaret Chen, 3 souls whose absence had created the space for this new kind of family to flourish. Love, Beth had learned, wasn't finite. It didn't diminish when shared across species or expanded when loss created room for unexpected connections. As darkness settled over the sanctuary, Shadow's evening howl rose into the star-filled sky. No longer the sound of grief that had echoed through the canyon 5 years ago, but a song of gratitude, of family, of home. Emma and Ethan added their young voices to the chorus, and somewhere in the harmony between human and wolf, Beth heard the answer to a question she'd been carrying since Rebecca's death. Love doesn't end when life ends. It just finds new forms, new families, new ways to heal the world, one heart at a time. This was their miracle, born from tragedy and nurtured by the simple truth that sometimes the most broken hearts are capable of the greatest love. Dear friends, as we reach the twilight of Shadow's incredible journey, I want you to close your eyes and imagine something. Picture yourself at 64, like Beth Morrison, believing your purpose died with your child. Picture the weight of medical bills, the loneliness of watching your spouse slip away to Alzheimer's, the crushing certainty that your best years are behind you. Now imagine discovering that your deepest pain could become your greatest gift, that the very losses that broke your heart could prepare you to heal others. Shadow didn't just save those babies. She saved Beth from a life of quiet desperation. At an age when society whispers we should step aside, Beth found her most meaningful work. The woman who thought she'd lost everything became the guardian of hope itself. Her story reminds us that our scars aren't disqualifications, they're qualifications for extraordinary purpose. Whether you're 55 or 68, whether you're caring for grandchildren or grieving empty nests, whether you're facing financial fears or health challenges, remember this: your story isn't ending. It's just beginning its most beautiful chapter. Love doesn't have expiration dates, and neither do second chances. What moment in your life taught you that love comes in unexpected forms? Have you ever found purpose in your pain? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.